children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
So, Bobby, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has figured out that what they want to do is they want to really close the courthouse door to people that have been nothing less than intentional victims of an industry that just, I mean, it's really no other way to characterize it except at the very least, if you're looking at this criminally, you'd call it manslaughter. Tell us the story of mesothelioma. Tell us who's at risk, why they're at risk, how this all came about.
Well, it's the mesothelioma victims right now who are at risk of the actions by the Chamber of Commerce. These are the people that have suffered this horrible cancer that's only caused by asbestos. There's maybe 27 million Americans who have been exposed, and the rate of these diagnoses is going up every year. And so there's more and more of these patients out there who need to make legal claims against the asbestos companies, but now the Chamber of Commerce, they're emboldened by their victories in the courts, and they're looking to make these patients victims once again. You
know, the story that I love, Bobby, the story they love to tell is about how poor Owens Corning Fiberglass there in Granville, Ohio, how they had to lay off almost 300 workers because of these asbestos suits. And then when you started really looking behind that story, first of all, it was a lie.
Well, they bogus it up.
They phonied the whole thing up. U.S. Chamber of Commerce, as they usually do, they went out and they hired a bunch of biostitutes, basically intellectual prostitutes that'll say damn near anything for the right amount of money. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce goes out and hires the National Economic Research Association, and they come up with this phonied up, bogus report claiming that the secondary impacts of asbestos liabilities in America are ruining our economy. But tell the story behind that. When all that BS was out there, when they were talking to congressmen, when they're actually testifying in front of committees under oath about this stuff, what was the truth about what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was really saying?
Well, they're trying to make it a national concern so that they can get preemption. They want the U.S. Congress to step in and take away the rights of these asbestos victims. So what they did is they phonied up this study. They paid this institute to come out with a report saying, oh, it was a big national economic crisis. And then they used figures of people that were laid off. Turns out they had nothing to do with, asbestos exposure litigation. They got laid off after the company declared bankruptcy and didn't need them anymore.
Yeah, I mean, my memory was there were people in the Science and Technology Research Center, that they were office workers that were laid off that had nothing at all to do with the research saga, not one bit.
Well, it's part of their plan, Pap, is now that they've been emboldened by these preemption decisions, we've seen it in the area of securities where they said, oh, the SEC now, they control everything, so even if there's fraud, you can't make a lawsuit against these companies that are at fault. They want to do the same thing with asbestos, so they phony up this national crisis so that they can get the Congress to do some bill, and then they want the courts to step in and say, okay, everything's been preempted, now you have no claims that you can make in a state court.
Let me put it in perspective. First of all, as you point out, malignant mesothelioma is, first of all, there's only one cause, and it's caused by asbestos. The second part of that is they've known that for decades now. The industry has known for decades that the product that they made would cause a disease that was so horrendous that when you talk to these people that are in the last couple of weeks of their life, they said, if you could just put a gun to my head and kill me, I'd be better off. That's how painful this disease is. It's a rare progressive cancer. It attacks the lining of the chest wall. There's nothing they can do about it. At best, they can prolong the life with chemotherapy, with very, very radical surgery. In a perfect world, they can have a lung transplant, which we know what the results of that typically is. Has a 30-year latency. In other words, a man that gets exposure to asbestos, it might be 30 years before the malignant mesothelioma shows itself. It's a very, very, very unique kind of cancer in the way that it encases the lungs and actually crushes the lungs with this huge tumor. And, what about the threshold limit on this? There's really no threshold, is there, Bobby?
Well, there's no safe level for being exposed to asbestos. Any of these fibers can get in with everybody that's been exposed. Now, this thing works in. We've seen up to 50 years of latency in some studies. So this is an ongoing concern. This is not old news. And the people that they're looking to protect now are, like you say, the ones that knew about it, but there's also these big companies that aren't in bankruptcy, and they've looked at this, and the winners in their scheme would be Dow Chemical be Ford Motors Company, General Motors, Honeywell, Pfizer, and Viacom.
Those are companies that are on the list of people that knew what was going on. I had every reason to know. I remember, Bobby, I remember us trying a case together. God, it had to be 20 years ago. We were some of the first people trying some of these cases throughout the country. And I remember some of the documents that we saw back then, the Sumner-Simpson documents, where if I were to characterize what the industry knew, we're talking about 1920s and the 1930s. You had an industry that were basically writing documents that if I were to distill what they had to say word for word, there are too many smoking gun documents. There's too many documents where you have CEOs saying, to hell with the workers, we need to make a profit. Basically, if you take all of those documents and you distill what they have to say, it comes out this way. These guys that are using asbestos make a good living with asbestos, and they can die with asbestos. That's their risk. Basically, that's what those documents say and mean. Every time I would read one of those documents to the jury, the jury, you would actually see them gasp at how callous these companies really were. But when you're talking about something called malignant mesothelioma, it's not just a slap on the wrist that ought to take place here. You see, I think, and you said this to me one time, I think in a conversation, I think, you would prefer that there be no lawsuits. You would prefer that what we do is we round these CEOs, these people that made these decisions, and we throw them in jail. And we take away the civil case. There's not a matter of the corporation going to trial and having to pay for the damages.
If there were any justice in the world, when you look at those documents, and remember how we had the experts talk about the state of the art, and all these companies knew it, and they had known it for decades, and then for people still now to be diagnosed and be told, look, you've worked hard all your life, now it's like a death sentence. It's 6 months to a year. It's a horrible thing, and they should have access to the courts.
How is it diagnosed? How does a person even suspect? I mean, you have some symptoms that start showing up. What are they?
Well, they're common to lung cancer, so there might be difficulty breathing. Fluid starts to fill up around the lungs, and doctors look for this, and the first thing they ask is, do you have a history of asbestos exposure? Once they find out you have some kind of history of asbestos exposure, they're going to look to do a biopsy, and they're going to find it's a definitive diagnosis right there that you've gotten this from asbestos.
Yeah, you remember the Ford case. In the Ford case, what the company did is they calculated how many people can die, and to where we have to pay the number of claims of people who died, and if we have to pay those claims, do we still make a profit? The same type of calculation took place in the asbestos industry at all different levels. For the insurance companies that reinsured these people, they made the calculations. The companies themselves made the calculations. And there's something else that these companies did about malignant mesothelioma. Here's what they figured. They figured we may not even be business 30 years from now. The guy's not going to remember the product he worked around. So these people that get exposure to asbestos, as you point out, there's no threshold issue. It can be 2 fibers. It can be 3 fibers that encase themselves in the parenchyma of the lung, the pleural lining of the lung, and then the tumor starts growing there. So who are the people exposed? Janitors. What is a janitor going to know about the products he worked around? Pipe fitters, they know mostly about what they worked around, but not all of it. Brake workers, construction workers. The industry actually knew and calculated that the people that were working around this stuff 30 years from now wouldn't have any idea that they were exposed to the stuff anyway, so what do we have to worry about?
Yeah, they were taking advantage of the latency period. You work in a transmission shop, you may not know you were exposed to asbestos, then it's, all these years later you get the diagnosis. So they were betting that they could ride this out. But now there's been some assessment of what is their potential liability, and these things the Chamber wants to do are bills that were going to save them billions of dollars.
What are they actually asking for? What does the Chamber of Commerce want for these corporate thugs, these criminals? I mean, there's no other way to put it. Some of these corporations are criminals. And given the chance, can we take them to civil court and make them pay damages, or should we throw them in jail? I would prefer we throw the management people who made these decisions in jail.